HBO's The Last of Us is good. It is very good. You already know that. Everyone and their neighbor's pet penguin cannot stop talking about how good this show is. And for the most part, I completely agree. It has a lot of things going for it after all. It's based off of a marvelous game that lends itself absolutely perfectly to the television format. It was being produced by a network that has proven time and time again that it can churn out excellent TV, particularly adaptations. Some fantastic casting, one showrunner with a great show under his belt and one who wrote the game originally, and an ass mountain of money being thrown at it meant this project was going to have to work really hard to mess it up. And thankfully, it didn't. This is a really solid show that displays virtually zero flaws seemingly inherent to the video game adaptation. It's basically blown any and every other live-action video game adaptation out of the water to the point where there's no real reason in even mentioning it anymore. It's the best one. But alas, it is not perfect. Practically nothing is, and this one certainly ain't either. With the show being entirely out now for a few weeks, I've really had time to sit with my thoughts, let them marinate, try to ignore my biases, and put aside how special the game was to me in order to deduce my true and honest thoughts. And although the show has only improved in my mind over time, it's still got way more flaws that I think most people are ignoring for one reason or another, both as a show and as an adaptation, though we'll try to primarily focus on the former. Let me just preface this by saying the show is never bad, never even close to bad. Most of my complaints revolve around aspects and moments being 6s or 7s and not 9s and 10s, but the show never delves into bad territory. It's way better and way more solid throughout than that. But one complaint with a good chunk of the show, particularly the first 2 episodes, is that it moves really slowly. Too slowly. Scenes draw out, pacing can be a touch choppy, and conversations that verge on boring and are ultimately useless in the grand scheme of things compose way too much of the runtime while the show needs to be spending its time more efficiently to reel in its audience before it loses them. Clearly I'm in the minority in this regard, but nothing in those first 2 episodes made me fall in love with this show. It just convinced me it was going to be hyper competent, which is amazing in and of itself, but as someone who already experienced the game, this didn't do anything special for me. And unfortunately that was something I went back to time and time again, and had to force myself to look past when dealing with this show. The concept of the game existing and succeeding so fantastically influencing the lens with which I analyze this show through. But here's the thing. I read A Song of Ice and Fire right before starting the show. I started book 1, read like a fiend, and then finished book 5 only a few weeks before starting season 1, episode 1. And that first season was so goddamn good and captivating and stunning that I finished that season in a single day. My personal life suffered, but I flourished. Just because you're familiar with the story does not mean you're gonna find certain elements boring or redundant. Being able to watch it in a different medium is enchanting all on its own. I found those first 2 episodes fine and dandy, but they didn't beg me to continue watching like other adaptations had. When thinking back on them, however, yeah, I am being too hard on them. Even calling them a high 7 or 8 is being too hard on them. They're good, they're great. They set the story and world well, and the openings with the scientists discussing the cordyceps, which wasn't in the game at all, was a great touch. Made it feel a lot more real and grounded, which is something the show clearly strived to achieve in lieu of a more blind, chaotic funfest. They removed the concept of spores for the show, which were pockets of air, often entire rooms or floors of buildings, composed of orange floating spore dots that would infect you if you inhaled them. This worked well for the game. It fit that medium really nicely. But as they said, in the real world that air would come and go, and it's not really realistic for certain areas to always be littered with them. Makes sense. That's a good change for what they were trying to do, and it also shows these showrunners clearly gave a shit and worked really hard on every detail to bring their vision to life. Giving us time with Sarah and Joel before her death and letting us get a feel for their relationship was way more important than I first realized. A lot of what is said and done by Joel towards Ellie as the story progresses revolves around the relationship he had with his daughter. Losing her is what caused him to become this way far more than the apocalypse, I'd say, and you can see how reluctant he is to even remotely let himself open up in this scary, lonely world. Plus, after he meets Ellie, where he's all tentative and cautious around her because of her bite, he immediately loses Tess. A loss he mourns and feels in his own way that isn't overly shown to us, but has to be impacting his mindset for a good chunk of the rest of the season's events. Tess's death, by the way, was a beautiful and horrible way to end the first 2 episodes, which I kinda grouped together because of what comes next. I also group episodes 4, 5, and 6 together for basically the same reason, as well as 8 and 9, so you can figure out the common denominator separating these sections. After she gets bitten, she sacrifices herself in a very brave and fitting way, allowing Ellie and Joel to benefit from her demise as she blows up the building and all of their pursuers along with it. Joel is very, on the surface at least, okay with letting this happen. He obviously doesn't like it, but she's infected and he clearly knows the next thing to do, as does Tess. He forces Ellie to carry on after a wonderful line from Tess, where she says, "Say who you can say." It mostly means Tess is gone but Ellie isn't, but I also interpreted it as Ellie being the key to saving perhaps the entire human race. That's who he can save, and he recognizes that quickly in the moment. In this moment as well, Ellie is far more reluctant to leave Tess, despite only meeting her recently. This is great characterization for everyone here, and maybe my favorite scene from these first 2 episodes. Also, the production here really is top notch, and something I definitely took for granted. It looks unreal. The infected look and sound great, the set design is wonderful, and the music is perfect. I almost kinda didn't notice the music at first because, yeah, that's the music from the game. But if the music had been something else, I definitely would have noticed. And in a bad way. This music is iconic and gorgeous and it fits this world so damn well. It's like it was made for it. And then we get to episode 3, which I will very curiously declare the best episode of TV I've seen in a while, and an odd episode of this show. When I first saw it, I thought it was gorgeous. A 10 out of 10. perfection. After a little while, I still loved it, but thought it messed with the pacing of the show far too much. I started to actually think of it as a bad addition to the show, despite my continued adoration for it independently. On rewatch, it's back to being a 10 out of 10 story that could have been implemented a bit better. When rewatching, I was stunned by how much screen time Ellie and Joel truly get. I thought it was like 5 minutes at the start and 5 minutes at the end, but it's actually a whole 15 at the start and another 12 at the end. Now that's more than enough time to give us some actual character work for the two of them, but the way it's given to us irks me. We get 15 at the start and 12 at the end, but in between those chunks, we get 0. And I think that's my main issue. After the death of Tess, we're now down to the 2 and only 2 people we'll be following and caring for the remainder of this show. As it should be. The show doesn't really spend too much time convincing us to really care about anyone else, and that's good. Joel and Ellie's relationship is this entire story. I wouldn't even say it's the core of the show, it just is the show. Heading to Bill's house, we get some great interactions between them to develop their nuanced relationship, and it transitions into the Bill and Frank storyline really well. Then we get nearly 45 minutes of just them. And yeah, I loved it. But then we get back to the real show afterwards, and any momentum their relationship gained was entirely lost. The emotions after leaving Tess, their reluctance to travel together, Joel's inability to let go, Ellie's snarkiness yet desperation to connect with someone, it all kind of fades away a bit. And I really think something as simple as splicing in brief scenes of them traveling together would fix this quite a lot, as we wouldn't get so engrossed in the Bill and Frank stuff and we'd remain engaged in the growth of their relationship. Would this diminish the Bill and Frank stuff? Yes, but I think that's worth the pacing of the show itself. The Bill and Frank stuff would still be amazing, but we need a bit more focus during this critical time juncture for Ellie and Joel. Again, I get that I'm in the minority here, but nothing in those first 2 episodes made me fall in love with either one of them, nor do I feel some sort of deep feelings towards their connection. They're just my main characters that I quite like and want to spend more time with now than ever. Now that they're on their own, this is the perfect time to begin some deeper character work, and they do that at the beginning, but then it's shoved aside too much in my opinion. Wonderful episode. God, I'm so glad it exists, but I'm reasonably sure some people, even the ones who loved this episode as much as I did, felt a tad bit less interested in the actual story when they returned back to it versus how they felt going into it. The ending is great though, where Ellie gets Joel to open up and enjoy the music during their ride. That's cute. Fuck, am I being too hard on this episode too? Episode 4 is great. In fact, episodes 4, 5, and 6 are certainly the best chunk of this show. Episode 4 is a tad slow at times, but the good kind of slow, and everything I wanted more of in the episode prior. In a binge format, this episode almost excuses the prior one, but this did come out week to week, so it's not a perfect problem solver. But it is really good. The scene with Brian, the man Ellie shoots while he attempts to choke Joel, is one of the best scenes of the whole show. He and all of his cronies act almost like NPCs during the scene, hurling generic insults while firing bullets that loudly ricochet off nearby structures. Then Ellie shoots him, and instead of dropping dead, he begs for his mom, tries to be their friend, offers him to trade, and panically admits he has no idea what to do. This NPC becomes a real human being so damn fast, and having his death be off-screen, since we're following Ellie and Joel makes her leave the room, farther punctuates Joel's lack of interest in killing people, even guilty ones. He did some awful stuff in the past, but he largely seems like he has and wants to continue moving on from that. It makes moments in later episodes, like the big climax at the hospital with the Fireflies and searching for Ellie while she's off gallivanting with David, even more powerful, but we'll get to that. This is where Ellie wins the right to carry a gun too, so we get more layers to their relationship, and it ends with them having a pretty cute conversation while they try to fall asleep. Some people say this episode has too much filler in it, but any moment in this show where the two of them are growing their relationship is not filler. That is the show, and I find it never gets boring or overindulgent with them. The writing and the acting is just way too damn solid, which it basically is 100% of the time in this show. Episode 5 gives us Henry and Sam, who I don't really care about, but it also gives us more time with Kathleen, who I care about even less. She's okay. She serves her role fine, I don't dislike her. She's a standard TV antagonist who enters after the opening and exits well before the ending. She's a bit fun to dislike, and she does drive the plot in her own way, though I wouldn't say she's essential. Her character is never even shown in the games, she's just the leader of the people hunting down Henry and Sam. I think her intro fell pretty flat in terms of her looking cool or powerful, and I think we get more wasted and bloated scenes with her establishing backstory and stuff than anyone else, so maybe I do dislike her. She's not boring on screen, she's just kinda whatever. I'm not mad at all that she exists, but I wouldn't have felt that something were missing if her little arc didn't exist either. Back to Sam and Henry here, and although I don't care too much about them, their addition to Ellie and Joel is interesting. I've held back from saying this a lot throughout this video, I've also failed a ton, but I'm only human, sorry. But there's a change here from the game where they age down Sam quite a bit. In the game, he's closer to Ellie's age, and they have a bit of a cute, wholesome romantic thing going on. It's probably the first time in a long time either one of them has met someone their age who is nice and cute and whatnot, and I really loved watching their interactions. In the show, Sam is 9, so Ellie assumes more of an older sister role, and honestly, I like it. About as much as I like their dynamic in the game, so I find it interesting to mention that the show made an unnecessary change like this that worked out well in its own way. I appreciate the decision, and their conversation before he turns is just as compelling in both, although how he turned in the game is a good deal better. But hey, I'd actually love to make a video on the changes between the game and the show and talk about which worked better and why the changes might have been made. So if that sounds interesting to you, then leave a comment down below, and don't forget to subscribe while you're at it, please. Episode 5 ends like Episode 2, with the death of a companion that has moved past rather quickly, highlighting the insane level of cruelty the survivors of this world have had to adjust to. It also climaxed with a giant horde of infected, which the show really doesn't have too much of, does it? The first time we see one, Tess's death, the ending of Episode 5, and then the backstory of Ellie and the opening with Ellie's mom. Is that it? Look, I get that they wanted to give the story a touch more realism, lean into the human psychological drama of it all, but they went a bit too far. Giving them less infected to battle through is a great decision. It ups the stakes of their every encounter. If you slaying them left and right, each time we meet them they're treated as nameless CGI aliens like in every superhero movie. They even mention that 2 is borderline impossible to overcome in combat, so they clearly made these things a lot more OP. But they set up those stakes being raised with each new encounter, and then they hardly ever have any new encounters. So what's the point? I get why they went with less infected scenes, but they went way overboard in my opinion. Regardless, episode 6 is really cute. Sneakily my favorite of the entire show. So many charming moments, like the opening with the couple in the lodge, Joel and Tommy reuniting, Joel letting Ellie choose who she wants to travel with, and Joel teaching Ellie how to shoot. Oh, not to mention a really wholesome moment where Maria gives Ellie a Diva Cup, which is even better because we see Ellie rooting around for some feminine hygiene products in an earlier episode. Not something you'd normally think of in a piece of apocalypse media, but a very important one. And episode 6 ends in a wonderfully fantastic way that episode 7 entirely ruins. Much like episode 3 kind of throwing off the pacing for Ellie and Joel's early dynamic, episode 7 opens just after Joel was stabbed. A brutal stabbing, one that knocks him clean off the horse and genuinely looks fatal, especially given the brutal and grounded tone of the show. Episode 7 opens with 2 whole minutes of us watching the light slowly fade from Joel's eyes, then cuts to a backstory of Ellie before she met Joel. Where episode 3 was absolutely fantastic storytelling in its own right, episode 7 is a complete and utter slog and no contest the worst episode of the season. Where my faults mostly lie is how entirely unmoved the narrative and our characters are after this episode. Since it's backstory, obviously the plot does not move forward. That can be okay. So do we at least learn something about Ellie that will be critical moving forward? Were we presented with this information at the perfect time for it to have setup and payoff later on? Neither. Got it. Oh, but we did learn Ellie is special and that she lost a friend in a traumatic way. Thank God. How noteworthy. To end the last episode, they stab Joel, and it's not obvious whether he's gonna live or die, so obviously they want us to care about that. But then they give us an entire hour of this shit? There's always a point during episodes like this where something happens, maybe a scene shifts into another or a mini arc starts to do more than simply set itself up, when the audience goes, fuck, this is the entire episode, isn't it? And I can't think of a single time that realization is met with glee or joy. Why do shows continue to do this? This show is way better than this. Anyways, I won't say the story here is entirely awful. Watching Ellie navigate her complicated life isn't completely boring, and them both getting bitten together and accepting their fate only for Ellie to never turn is quite interesting. But Riley is dull and not very likable, and most of the scenes in this episode are just vaguely romantic nothingness. I was never glued to my screen, never cared what was going to happen next since the interesting parts had no mystery left in them, and then episode 8 eventually starts and we find out this episode really didn't matter. Like, at all. We don't need to spend any more time on this. I consider it an incredibly annoying and hurtful speed bump wedged right in the middle of this show's best episodes, and one I can guarantee will be skipped most on rewatches, which is sad. But when an episode makes 0 attempts to move the story forward, which isn't always a bad thing, mind you, while refusing to give us something worth watching in terms of information or even just pure enjoyment, then that's what you get. Now into episode 8 and the David arc, by far my favorite part of the game. Truly and honestly, the few hours at the end of this portion of the game, and especially the climax, might be my favorite video game moment of all time, and the entire thing is just gold, especially the way it starts. Though it's a far departure from the way it is in the show, so we won't get into it. This show doesn't waste much time in letting David convince Ellie he's a good guy, so whatever. I think it's a poor change, but it doesn't really make this story bad, just worse. But this actor is excellent despite not really embodying the original character much. In fact, a very fun fact about the show is that the showrunners asked the main characters at least, not entirely sure about the others, to not play the game beforehand. That way, instead of Pedro Pascal playing video game Joel, he would just be playing a character who is essentially the same, but he could make his own decisions on how to handle certain nuances since he wouldn't be necessarily copying something else. He'd just be reading a script and getting direction. It vaguely irked me when I first heard about it, but now I actually think it was a brilliant decision that paid dividends, because it gives every character in their show their own vibe that fits this world and this story perfectly. It's also why I went from really hating this Ellie to actually kind of liking her a good amount. She's just not game Ellie to me, and that's okay. She fits this story really well, and although I like game Ellie a whole hell of a lot more, I like that the show let these characters be a bit more distinct without even coming close to not being the same character. Sometimes I want my adaptations to be one-for-one copy, but usually those lose their appeal over time. This way the show has a better chance to stand on its own, and its changes are easier to swallow for fans of the game because you can recognize the subtle differences. Another fun fact is that this guy is the guy who voices Joel in the games. Lovely. David is menacing and gross and has just enough humanity in him to slightly feel as though he may not be an awful guy. Then he hits on Ellie and it's revealed he's eating people, so I'm not saying it lasts long, but it's nice to see an antagonist who had shades of grey for a moment there. Ellie's a total badass for large chunks of this episode, even if sometimes she's not making the best choices. But she does have some sick-ass lines and even some sick-ass kills, like proper cool. Her kill on David's friend is probably my favorite in the entire show. Watching Joel turn into the fucking Punisher to track Ellie down is fantastic. Like the foreshadowing I mentioned when he shows his aversion to killing after Ellie shoots Brian, having him only do this sometimes punctuates why he's acting like this, namely his powerful love for Ellie. Aww. Another wonderful attention to detail moment here is that Joel, when embracing Ellie after she finally murdered the fucking fuck out of David, refers to her as baby girl, a term of endearment we haven't heard him say since episode 1 when he called his daughter Sarah baby girl. If Ellie and Joel turning into a true father-daughter relationship wasn't obvious enough, now it should be. And also now is when I'd say Joel fully acknowledges to himself that Ellie is now the most important thing in his life. I'm sure he'd been slowly building up to that obvious realization leading up to then, but holding her in his arms after he escaped David and he committed several war crimes to get to her probably makes it so not even he can ignore his true feelings. Episode 9 was a bit disappointing. The show has really taken its time a lot here, mostly in a good way, but sometimes I wish they'd hurry shit up. And yet here they decide to have their shortest episode yet in the finale and turn an hours-long climactic escape mission into a quick slow-mo montage? A lot of the emotion and comprehension of this episode suffers because of how hastily it begins and ends, but it wasn't awful. Just weaker than I hoped and weaker than I was expecting, because aside from one major road bump along the way, I was not only really getting into the show, but really coming to appreciate just how well done it was. The opening was neat. Not in the game. Before this, we never really had a reason for why Ellie was immune. So this is pretty cool to see, and honestly really interesting because as messed up as it is, her birth isn't that hard to replicate. If the right people knew about this, then they could use this knowledge to breed a whole host of immune people and begin to rebuild society. Good people like the Fireflies might be able to, based on the way most people talk about them. But they fucking suck ass, and yeah, Joel went a little crazy and overboard. A lot crazy and overboard. But if this was humanity's last chance at salvation, Ellie's immunity being researched, I blame the Fireflies for humanity failing, not Joel. Why are they so rude? I get it. This sitch with Ellie is important, but how about I paint a picture for you based on something the Fireflies could possibly do? Drug Ellie and Joel. Bring them both to a safe, secure room. Cozy, but very, very secure from them leaving. Give them the same bullshit reason from before about not knowing who they were and just being cautious. Joel will respect that on some level. Have Marlene come in and talk to them. Kindly. Explain their thoughts, explain what they want, give them time to discuss either as a group or on their own. All while this is going on, mind you, have 75 covert snipers trained on both of them. One on Ellie with a trank and one on Joel that will kill him dead. Let them make this decision, the right decision, and then help the situation work itself out. Provide Joel with comfort and care. Give Ellie her last wishes and assure both of them that this could be the thing that truly saves all of humanity. They could become selfless heroes on a scale hitherto unheard of. And if they don't decide to go through with your plan, then just kill Joel and drug Ellie and operate on her anyways. It's gray, but the moral high ground is absolutely in the Fireflies' corner. But what do they do instead? Well, they practically kick Joel into a corner, tell him he's a nerd, ask him if he wants a Hertz donut, say we're killing your kid, oh my god, get over it, I'm actually sadder, you know, because I held her as a bloody bag of potatoes 14 years ago. Why do you even care? Oh, by the way, we're gonna escort you out of here and my guys are gonna treat you like a multinational terrorist, and every time you start walking slowly, maybe because you become distraught with trauma or bitter grief or something like that, they'll hurl insults at you, shove you roughly from behind, and simply beg for the privilege of murdering you dead. Even when vaguely irritated, wouldn't continuously being shoved in the back make your wires cross a bit? Now imagine you've got Joel's temperament and then, oh yeah, they're murdering your daughter in the next room over. I swear to god, it's so much worse in the game too. One of those guys even tells Joel to give him an excuse. They're dying to execute this man whose life they just ripped apart. Why? Why are they such dicks? The Fireflies pushed Joel to lash out in the way that he did. Would he have maybe done the same regardless? Maybe. Probably, but we'll never know now since they treat him like the Unabomber from minute 1 and never allow him to feel anything other than unbridled rage and torment. The game does every single aspect of this episode better, except for the giraffes. The show nailed that. Bravo. In my other video, if this one does well enough, I'd love to spell it out, but truly the scene leading up to their capture is better, the battle through the hospital carries way more emotion and stress, the final few scenes in the car and walking through the mountains are basically line for line, shot for shot, so there's that.
Is it everything you hoped for?
Jury's still out. But man, you can't deny that view.
While some changes are just straight up better and enhance every aspect of the story, many are perfectly neutral, maybe borderline unnecessary, and more than a few make for poor, less impactful moments. A bit of a mixed bag, but you can really tell these showrunners put their heart and soul into this project, and any mistake they made along the way doesn't really detract from the show's critical success. Except for episode 7. HBO's The Last of Us adapted the beloved game built for TV wonderfully well. It exceeded practically any and all expectations, and with things like Amazon Prime's new God of War show in development, and even successes like Sonic the Hedgehog, Arcane, and the exciting build-up to the Mario movie, I think we are living through the official epoch of video games being done well in other mediums. With The Last of Us being the first one of these to really adapt and tell the exact same story, I do think it will receive its much-deserved credit as the one to officially usher this new age in. Regardless of any and all flaws in the show, that is something I will be forever grateful for.